Imagine this. You're at work, doing your job, minding your own business, when suddenly, someone decides to treat you like you're less than human. Not because of anything you've done, but because of who you are. It's a scenario that's all too familiar for many, but what happens next can sometimes change everything. This is a story about respect, dignity, and the kind of lesson that leaves a mark, not just on the people who need to learn it, but on everyone who witnesses it. Today, we're diving into a moment that unfolded in a small, unassuming restaurant, where a group of rude tourists crossed a line they never should have, and a black waiter decided enough was enough. What happened next? Well, let's just say it's a story you won't forget. It all started on a busy Friday evening. The restaurant was packed, the kind of place where the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filled the air. Among the staff was Marcus, a waiter who had been working there for years. He was known for his calm demeanor, his quick wit, and his ability to handle even the most difficult customers with grace. But that night, he was about to face a challenge unlike any other. Enter a group of tourists, loud, entitled, and clearly used to getting their way. From the moment they walked in, they made it clear they thought they were above everyone else. They snapped their fingers, rolled their eyes, and made snide comments about the service. But it wasn't just their rudeness that stood out. It was the way they looked at Marcus, the way they spoke to him, like he was invisible, like he didn't matter. First, Marcus did what he always did. He stayed professional. He smiled, took their orders, and tried to brush off their insults. But as the night went on, their behavior only got worse. They made jokes about his accent, mocked his appearance, and even made a comment about his skin color. It was one of those moments where everyone in the restaurant seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how he would respond. And then, something shifted. Marcus, who had always been the picture of patience, decided he wasn't going to take it anymore. But he didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He stood his ground, looked them in the eye, and delivered a lesson they never saw coming. What did he say? How did they react? And what happened after that? Well, that's where things get interesting. Because this wasn't just a story about a waiter standing up to rude customers. It was a story about what happens when someone decides they've had enough, when they refuse to be treated as less than they are. It's a story about the power of dignity, the strength it takes to stand up for yourself, and the ripple effect that one moment can have on everyone around you. But before we get to the climax, before we see how it all unfolds, let's take a step back and really understand the people involved, the tension in the air, and the moment that changed everything. Because this isn't just a story about a lesson. It's a story about humanity, and sometimes those are the stories that hit the hardest. So, what happened next? Well, you'll have to keep watching to find out. Marcus had always been the kind of person who could keep his cool, no matter what. Growing up in a tight-knit community, he'd learned early on that life wasn't always fair, but how you responded to it, that's what defined you. He'd worked at the restaurant for nearly a decade, starting as a busboy and working his way up to head waiter. It wasn't just a job to him. It was a place where he felt like he belonged. The regulars knew him by name, the staff respected him, and even on the toughest nights, he found a way to keep smiling. But this group of tourists? They were different. They didn't see him as a person. They saw him as someone they could push around, someone they could belittle without consequence. And that's where they were wrong. The group had come in laughing, their voices carrying over the din of the restaurant. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, dressed in expensive clothes and flashing designer accessories. They looked like they just stepped out of a luxury resort, and they acted like they owned the place. From the moment they sat down, they were demanding. They wanted the best table, the best wine, the best of everything. And when Marcus approached to take their order, one of the men barely looked at him, just waved his hand dismissively and said, "Hurry up, we don't have all night." It was the kind of comment that could make anyone's blood boil, but Marcus just nodded and kept his tone polite. He'd dealt with difficult customers before. He could handle this. But then the comments started. One of the women made a snide remark about the menu, saying it was too ethnic for her taste. Another joked about how long it was taking for their food to arrive, even though it had only been a few minutes. And then, as Marcus was refilling their water glasses, One of the men leaned back in his chair and said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, I don't know why they even bother hiring people like him. Can't they find someone who speaks proper English? The table erupted in laughter, and for a moment, Marcus froze. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks, the sting of their words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. He just finished pouring the water, set the pitcher down, and walked away. Back in the kitchen, Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he knew he couldn't let it show. Not here, not now. His coworkers noticed something was off and asked if he was okay. He just shook his head and said, It's fine. I've got it. But it wasn't fine. It wasn't fine at all. Because this wasn't just about rude customers. It was about something deeper, something uglier. It was about the way they looked at him, the way they talked to him, like he was less than human. And Marcus knew he couldn't let that slide. Not this time. As the night went on, the group's behavior only got worse. They complained about the food, sent dishes back for no reason, and snapped their fingers every time they wanted something. And through it all, Marcus kept his composure. He smiled, he nodded, he did his job, but inside, he was seething. He kept thinking about all the times he'd been treated this way, all the times he'd had to swallow his pride and keep going. And he realized something. He was tired. Tired of being disrespected, tired of being treated like he didn't matter. And he knew he couldn't let this go. Not again. The breaking point came when one of the women called him over to the table. She held up her glass and said, This wine tastes off. Did you even check it before you brought it out? Marcus took the glass, smelled it, and said, It's fine, ma'am. It's the same wine you ordered. She rolled her eyes and said, Well, maybe you just don't know what good wine tastes like. The table laughed again, and that's when something inside Marcus snapped. He set the glass down, looked her straight in the eye, and said, Ma'am, I've been working here for 10 years. I know more about wine than you ever will. The table went silent. For a moment, no one said a word. And then, one of the men stood up, his face red with anger. Who do you think you're talking to? He demanded. You can't talk to us like that. Marcus didn't back down. He stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. I'm talking to you, he said. And I'm telling you that I don't deserve to be treated this way. No one does. The man took a step closer, his fists clenched, but before he could say anything, the restaurant manager, a woman named Sarah, rushed over. Is everything okay here? She asked, her eyes darting between Marcus and the tourists. The man pointed at Marcus and said, This guy's got an attitude problem. You need to do something about it. Sarah looked at Marcus, then back at the man. I'll handle this, she said. Please sit down. The man hesitated, then sat back down, muttering under his breath. Sarah pulled Marcus aside and said, What's going on? Marcus took a deep breath and told her everything. The comments, the insults, the way they'd been treating him all night. Sarah listened, her expression growing more serious with every word. When he was done, she nodded and said, I'll take care of it. You don't have to deal with this. But Marcus shook his head. No, he said. I'm not going to let them think they can get away with this. I'm not going to let them win. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, she said, but be careful. I've got your back. Marcus thanked her and walked back to the table. The tourists were still glaring at him, their faces full of anger and disbelief. But Marcus didn't care. He knew what he had to do. He looked at each of them in turn, his voice steady and strong. You think you can come in here and treat people like this? He said. You think you can insult me, belittle me, and get away with it? Well, you're wrong. Because I'm not going to let you. Not tonight, not ever. The table was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. And then, one of the women stood up, her face pale. We're leaving, she said, grabbing her purse. The others followed suit, scrambling to their feet and heading for the door. But before they left, Marcus called after them. Next time, he said, think twice before you treat someone like they're less than you. Because you never know who might teach you a lesson you'll never forget. The door slammed shut behind them, and the restaurant erupted in applause. The other customers, who had been watching the whole thing, clapped and cheered for Marcus. But he didn't feel like celebrating. He just felt tired. Tired of the fight. Tired of the struggle. But he also felt something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Because he'd stood up for himself, and he'd done it without losing his dignity. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything. But the story doesn't end there. Because as Marcus was cleaning up the table, he noticed something, a wallet, left behind by one of the tourists. He picked it up, his mind racing. What should he do? Return it? Keep it? Or use it to teach them one final lesson? The choice was his, and whatever he decided, it was going to change everything. But that's a story for another time. Marcus stood there, holding the wallet in his hand, feeling its weight as if it carried more than just cash and cards. It felt like a symbol, a reminder of the power dynamics that had played out that night. He flipped it open and saw the name on the driver's license, Ethan Carter, the man who had been the loudest, the most aggressive, the one who had tried to intimidate him. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what kind of person Ethan was outside of this moment. Did he always treat people this way? Or was it just when he thought no one was watching? The wallet was stuffed with bills, a few credit cards, and a photo of a woman and a little girl, maybe his family. For a split second, Marcus felt a pang of guilt. But then he remembered the way Ethan had looked at him, the way he'd spoken to him, and that guilt turned into something else. Resolve. He closed the wallet and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with it yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he finished clearing the table, his mind raced with possibilities. Should he return it? Should he confront Ethan? Or should he use it as leverage to make sure they never treated anyone like that again? The thought of holding power over someone who had tried to belittle him was tempting, but Marcus wasn't that kind of person. He didn't want to stoop to their level. Still, he couldn't just let this go. Not after everything that had happened. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, the group of tourists was in chaos. Ethan was fuming, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. "I can't believe that guy," he muttered, his face red with anger. "Who does he think he is, talking to us like that?" The others nodded in agreement, but there was a tension in the air. A sense that maybe, just maybe, they'd gone too far. One of the women, Claire, spoke up. "Ethan, maybe we should just let it go. We were kind of harsh." Ethan shot her a glare. "Harsh? Are you kidding me? That guy was out of line. He doesn't get to talk to us like that." But Claire didn't back down. "I'm just saying, maybe we should think about how we acted. It wasn't exactly our finest moment." Ethan didn't respond, but the look on his face said it all. He wasn't ready to admit he was wrong. Not yet. Back inside the restaurant, Marcus was finishing up his shift. Sarah, the manager, pulled him aside. "You okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus nodded, but his expression was distant. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Sarah studied him for a moment, then said, "You know, what you did tonight, it took a lot of courage. Not everyone would have stood up to them like that." Marcus shrugged. "I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let them treat me like that." Sarah nodded. "I get it. But just be careful, okay? People like that, they don't like being challenged. And they don't always play fair." Marcus knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. Not after what had happened as he left the restaurant. Marcus felt the weight of the wallet in his pocket. He still hadn't decided what to do with it, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Ethan and his friends off the hook that easily. He thought about the photo in the wallet, the woman and the little girl. Were they proud of Ethan? Did they know how he treated people when he thought no one was watching? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions, about making sure they understood the impact of their behavior. But how? The next morning, Marcus woke up with a plan. He wasn't sure if it was the right one, but it was the only thing he could think of. He took out the wallet and looked at it again. Ethan's address was on the driver's license. Marcus could return it, face to face. But he wasn't going to just hand it over and walk away. No, he was going to make sure Ethan understood exactly what he'd done and why it mattered. It was a risky move, But Marcus didn't care. He was done playing it safe. Meanwhile, Ethan was having a rough morning. He'd realized his wallet was missing and was frantically retracing his steps. He called the restaurant, but no one had turned it in. He was starting to panic. His credit cards, his cash, his ID, it was all gone. And then there was the photo, the one of his wife and daughter. He couldn't lose that. He just couldn't. As he paced around his hotel room, his phone rang. It was Claire. "Any luck?" she asked. Ethan sighed. "No, nothing. I don't know what to do." There was a pause, and then Claire said, "Maybe this is a sign, Ethan. Maybe it's time to think about how we acted last night." Ethan didn't respond. He just hung up the phone and sat down, his head in his hands. What Ethan didn't know was that Marcus was already on his way. He'd found the hotel address online and was heading there now. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. This wasn't just about a wallet anymore. It was about respect, about dignity, about standing up for what was right. And Marcus wasn't going to let this go. Not until Ethan understood the lesson he needed to learn. But as Marcus approached the hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about to get a lot more complicated. What would Ethan do when he saw him? Would he apologize? Would he get angry? Or would he try to turn the tables and make Marcus out to be the bad guy? Marcus didn't know, but he was about to find out. And whatever happened next, one thing was certain. This was a lesson Ethan would never forget. But would it be enough to change him? Or would it just make things worse? Only time would tell.